welcome everyone to this, I guess, kind of unusual edition of the Annoying Peasant Radio Show. I'm not at my usual location, so I don't have my studio, so I'm trying to make it work, I guess, as it were. Hopefully this is coming through okay. I see Tanya's joined me in the chat room, so I'm not completely alone tonight, so that's always good. Thanks, Tanya, for joining me. Let me get this music down so I can really get going. Okay, thanks. Here we go. Welcome to this episode of the Annoying Peasant Radio Show. Of course, my name is Tom. I'm going it alone tonight, so Brad will not be with me. And hopefully I'm going to be able to keep this show a little on the shorter side. Like to do that if we can. Our shows have been getting so long, so we're trying to shorten them up a little bit. We will be changing the show to a podcast. A whole lot of changes coming. Anyway, just so you know, for tonight we're going to talk about the EU a little bit and the inevitable fate of the European Union. So thanks for listening, and I hope that I can raise a number of interesting and important issues and hope you will consider them deeply. And not only in the context of the EU, but, you know, in the wider, or the broader perspective, I guess, too, would be kind of important. So hopefully that will resonate with you a little bit. If anyone is listening, else is listening live, the chat room is open. And hey, I'd love to have your comments in there. If yeah, Tanya, who me? To get some interaction in the show, since again I'm doing it by myself. I wanted to start tonight though by talking about what I began the show with last week. And I know that's very difficult for most, and again, that's why I want to go over this. But I wanted to talk about how people have come to their positions, their political positions, I guess most people would call that, right? And I think most people come to those positions based on what they know or understand to be right and wrong, right? Just what makes sense to them and what doesn't make sense. That's why they choose or don't choose a certain side on an issue. And I think that largely, pertains to me as well in my earlier years of my life. And your political discussions tend to be just a debate of opinion, right? And whoever feels at the moment they can support that opinion more strongly or stronger is the victor and kind of rules the day for the moment. Although, I think most people, their experience is that no one comes forward and really claims victory. Well, maybe people claim victory, but nobody claims defeat. And there's very few times that people say, you know what, you make a strong argument, I'm switching to your side. Not like I expect that to happen with this show, especially on any one issue, because this may sound wacky. The issues are somewhat secondary for me. It's the political philosophy of liberty that is paramount, and that's what I'm trying to get through to people. And sometimes I use issues, like I will tonight, talk about the EU and some of the recent stories regarding the EU that are in the news. And people will say, hey, I agree with you on this, or I disagree with you on that. And that's really not what I'm aiming for. Sure, I'm happy to begin the discussion. But what I'm really trying to drive to is the political philosophy of freedom. And tonight, more precisely, what I'm trying to drive at is this is not a notion of my opinion, or this is not stuff that I just came up with or that I built on my own. That is specifically not the case. This is rooted in deduction and logic, coming from what is called axiomatic statements. It takes a little bit of explaining, but essentially it's statements that you cannot logically argue with, or you can't logically contradict, is maybe the better way of stating that. And last week I talked about Hop a little bit, and I'm going to read pretty much what I read last week. And if anyone new is listening, obviously it's new to them, but I still think it's very important, and stuff that I reread the same stuff time and time again. I learn something every time. So hopefully this will be meaningful. This is from Hans Hermann Hoppe's The God That Failed, if I remember that. I'm seeing if I have that documented from last week so I can tell you. Yes. Um, and this is where he discusses how he approaches his topic in the book. Again, the title being Democracy, the God That Failed. Um, and I'm just going to read a little bit. He says, while history will play an important role, the following is not the work of a historian, however, but of a political economist and philosopher. There are no new or unfamiliar data presented. Rather, insofar as a claim to originality is made, it is that the following studies contain new and unfamiliar interpretations of generally known and accepted facts. I'm going to step out for a second. So he's really what he's trying to do is get you to not argue about the facts of the matter. What he's trying to do is bring a new interpretation of those facts. In other words, what do those facts lead you to understand as a more general concept, right? And he's going to drive that argument to an interpretation that you likely are not familiar with unless you're very familiar with the political philosophy of freedom. And that's what I find is rather interesting. Many people like to argue over the facts. By the way, in this case, I don't believe he's actually saying that I'm using the facts to create the foundation of my argument, right? He's actually just saying in this study he's going to be using accepted facts. The core of his argument is, again, logical deduction from axiomatic statements. And I think that's paramount as well. But as an example of the interpretation or his different interpretation of facts, you say one may, for instance, readily agree on the fact in 19th century America, average living standards, tax rates, and economic regulations were comparatively low, while in the 20th century, living standards higher because of taxes and regulations or despite higher taxes and regulations, right? I'm more familiar with more recently people point to the Clinton years and say, hey, Clinton raised taxes and the economy grew. People try to draw a little cause and effect from that. So raising taxes caused the economy to boom. If that was the case, I don't understand why we wouldn't just raise taxes to 100%. We'd be the wealthiest people on the planet. But again, stop and think of that for a second. If your tax rate was 100%, you wouldn't have any wealth. But he shows through logical deduction that that's actually not true. It's not that it's not true. It's not possible. Okay. So those are the kind of things I addressed with Brad, I believe, last week on, kind of how to think, how to come to this, not by, again, saying, hey, I agree with you on 20 issues in a row, so I guess I must understand or agree with the political philosophy of freedom, which is a weird thing to say. It's nonsensical. I just use that term because people would tend to say things like that. It's not that I'm asking you to agree with me. I'm not asking you to agree with, again, a weird thing, the political philosophy of freedom. I'm asking you to understand it. It's much like, and much overused analogy that I have is, it's much like gravity. I'm not asking you to agree with gravity, right? That sounds even crazy to say something like that. I'm asking you to understand it. And I think that's where the real value lies, and maybe that uncovers a little better what I'm attempting to do here. So I think that's paramount in the discussion as we go forward tonight and in future shows as well. I'm going to take a second here and go back and check. Oh, yeah. The chat room. Anyway, we usually do these announcements, so I'm going to zip through them kind of quickly. Of course, Agora Fest 2015 at the Villa Maria Conference Center and Retreat. That's September 24th to 27th. And when I get back to my home base, I will rearrange to have Nick Ludwig on the show. He's got some really cool activities that are going on there. Drone races, a couple other things that were really interesting, and I wanted to get them back on before, with enough lead time for people to make adjustments. If they weren't thinking of going, if something really trips their trigger, they may want to consider to go. Anyway, again, that's September 24th to 27th, and it's called Agora Fest 2015. Check out the Facebook page. Tanya, Tim, Cassie, Trigger. I can't remember if there's anybody else. If somebody else is in there that helps me, I apologize. You guys do a great job, and I really appreciate it. Interesting stuff on there. I know more the edgy ones are triggers, which is fine. I like those. Those are very cool. So keep up the good work there, everybody. And if anybody's listening that has interest in the topic, check out that Facebook page. Again, it's Annoying Peasant Radio, and they have some really cool stuff on there. Stuff to really start a discussion. Anyway, we'll be live next week, Tuesday. That's one of the early in August. I can't remember the date off the top of my head. We'll be live again at 7 Central. Hopefully I can get this taken care of, that I can get Brad with me next week, working on it, but I just was not successful in time. So I'm going to move along. A little bit of news. I was going to go a little deeper into some of this stuff, but in order to shorten the show, I'm going to just, make you aware of some of the things. I think there's like 16, 17, 18 Republicans now that are in as part of the primary process for the office of president for 2016. We're obviously a little more, 15 months, something like that away, 16 months, whatever it is, from the election. But John Kasich, I believe, is the last one now, at least at the moment, to join the candidates for president, and he's a standing Ohio governor. So we have an Ohio governor, a Wisconsin governor, New Jersey governor. I'm sure I'm missing a bunch on the Republican side I'm talking about. So a lot of stuff there. Kasich, I believe he has like a 54% approval rating in Ohio, and you say, well, he doesn't poll very well nationally. I think he's around the 2% number. Why would a guy get in the ring? Well, I think part of the strategy is, of course, Ohio is a big state that the Republicans need, and if he could win Ohio, basically he brings to the table that I can bring you Ohio. Maybe there's additional value there, so the party backs him more strongly or stronger than others, and that brings him eventually to national prominence. I'm not entirely sure what the deal is there, but that's just my speculation. But I just want to quote real quickly. He says, "I will promise you that my top priority will get this country on a path to fiscal independence, strength, and we will rebuild the economy of this country because creating jobs is our highest moral purpose," he said. That was a quote. But by the way, the U.S. military, of course, would be an exception to the tight government spending because the United States needs to restore its role in the world. And, there's all kinds of things I could comment on there, and we could go all night on that. But I just wanted to point that out and put that in people's minds. One of the things that other conservatives, have criticized Kasich for is taking federal money for an expansion of Medicaid in Ohio under President Barack Obama's signature health care law. So he calls himself a compassionate conservative. And he does interject religion, by the way, in his campaign. And I know that's, it's a long story there. The bottom line for me is, I would argue, it's not a universal ethic, so it doesn't apply to all, but whatever. What I wanted to do tonight, too, was do an audio clip from Ted Cruz from the Rush Limbaugh show, and I was unable to make that work from a technical standpoint. But I think there was, some interesting stuff going on there. Maybe the big deal was, Ted Cruz had criticized Mitch McConnell because he says Mitch McConnell lied to him. Well, and that's why Rush had him on his show being interviewed to talk about that. They wound up talking a little bit about the Import-Export Bank, and Rush asked him what that bank actually is. And it was very interesting that Ted Cruz basically kind of went off and said, the whole deal is we were told we needed a Republican majority in the House. And he cited the years, I can't remember, was it 2012 that came to pass? Right? Then they needed a Republican majority in the Senate, and if I'm correct, it happened in 2014. And the deal was, well, then things will get changed. Well, he makes the case that, hey, everything that's gone through How would it have been different had this been a Democrat majority? And it drives to the point, and the point that Tanya's helped me make on this show many times when she's been here about representative government and other shows. How's the voting working, right? Not only does he go on to talk about that, but he goes much deeper, which I think he really buried all the politicians by saying, hey, here's the deal. Guys come in and they're basically bought and sold by lobbyists. So they don't even do what they claim they're going to do. Well, I think we kind of all have known that for many, many years anyway, right? That's not new news. But he basically pointed and said the system is what's corrupting. And then that leads me right back to the same question. So we're going to vote some different people in. How does that change the system, right? We just have different names under the titles, but it doesn't really fix anything. It's I would argue what they call reform, and I think reform cannot work. Not only that, it doesn't work. And again, you could say, look at history. I think history is a giant example of how it doesn't work. This election is not the first time I've heard that, hey, we're going to change things, we're going to make things better. And here we are nonetheless. And again, I don't want to go too deep with that tonight, but I did want to get to the EU. There's some interesting thing, and I did also, I had an article. I don't know if I posted that on Facebook page yet, but I will if I'll check if it's not there. It was, I don't know, it was it showed a video of Angela Merkel telling a Palestinian girl that she can't stay in Germany. Now, I know that, a lot of you are going to be very upset and say, hey, all these countries, whether it be Germany, the U.S., any wealthier country, they cannot take on an unlimited amount of people. And I'll just say, or illegals, I don't know what you want to call them. I'll just hang on for 1 second. Let me get my point out first, and then we'll I think we'll wind up addressing that. But I guess the real story is Angela Merkel stood in front of a live TV camera and told a sobbing teenage girl that she couldn't stay in Germany, right? And the girl was of Palestinian descent. I believe she was there, of course, illegally, and that was the deal. And she said, basically, my dream is to go to the university, and she may have expanded a little beyond that, but, that was the point. For me, a couple of things just that I observed from there. She spoke German apparently very well, and, I'm not the true test there of what the best German is, to be sure, but she seemed to be very fluent. Merkel didn't appear to have any trouble understanding her whatsoever. So my point is, she did make some effort, of course, to be assimilated into the society to do so. And again, I'm not telling you that assimilation is necessarily a good thing. I'm saying speaking another language is a good thing, to be sure. But after she made this, passionate, it's not really a plea, a statement, just, of her dream, of what she wanted to do, Merkel said that, politics, Merkel, I guess, says politics is hard sometimes. And she expanded on that, but basically said, therefore, we can't, if we take you, many more will continue to come, and we can't take them all in. But when she says politics is hard sometimes, well, actually, for Merkel, it's not too hard. It's really not too hard to say, hey, you can't stay here. You'll have to go back or somewhere else where likely it's of a lower standard of living, right? That's really not too hard to say. So politics isn't really hard on Merkel and the ruling elites. It's actually harder on other people. So I just got a little chuckle out of that when she said that. And partly the deal is you say, well, hey, you're not understanding the situation here that, illegals would take advantage of the social safety net. And again, as Merkel, I said, what Merkel made her point being that, hey, you can't stay here because if you do, more will come, right? But think about this for a second. It's usually painted that way that, well, wait a minute, if we have this welfare system, the illegals will come and they'll continue to come. Well, it's usually thought in that context of illegals, illegal aliens, again, however you want to describe them. But wouldn't the same set of incentives be in place for citizens of that country? In other words, if a social safety net is drawing people that they don't want, doesn't a social safety net provide the same incentives for some citizens? In other words, they may choose not to work, they may choose to be on the social safety net instead, right? Basically live off of someone else's dime. That's kind of one of my takes from this is the context here is on the aliens, and it's frequently the same in the States, to be sure. But anyone on that social safety net, and people say, well, you got to have a social safety net, and also, and they'll say, well, you're heartless, you don't support helping people. That's not at all the case. The problem with what we know today as the social safety net is how it's funded, right? There's the trouble. And I don't want to go too deep in that. I just want to raise the issues tonight, and I want you to really kind of think about them. That's the deal. And I also wanted to go to, probably in my discussion, a lot of people are probably thinking, well, if I'm kind of ragging on Merkel, saying that this girl of Palestinian descent needs to be sent at least away, if not back to Palestine. Again, I'm not completely familiar with the details of her order there, or the German laws. I think many of you would think, well, then I'm automatically, in a sense, for open borders, right? If I'm saying, hey, you can't send these people back, then you're for open borders. And I would also say you are wrong there. And think about this. This is how I try to look at many of what are seen to be a little more complex cases, that people think, how will countries deal with these certain problems? Well, I think part of the issue is, in a free society, there would be no such thing as public property. There would be no such thing as public goods. So to give you a little bit better or closer of an analogy, think of it again in the personal case, right? I would be able to actually own property in a free society. If I own a property, I could have people come to my property who were invited, right? Anyone uninvited is basically a trespasser, and I could ask them to leave. If it came to it, I could have my security force or myself, basically make them leave my property because they're violating my property rights. I could pursue it further in private courts if I so desired, et cetera, et cetera. But that's not really the point. The point is you'd have invited guests, right? Anyone uninvited, you essentially would repel in some way. Well, why couldn't countries do the same thing? And again, countries wouldn't be doing this if it was a fully free society. And you'd say, well, then wait a minute, there'd be no immigration. All these societies would be stagnant, and that's clearly not the case as well. As an example, I know 40, 50 years ago, to immigrate to the United States, you needed to have a sponsor, which was basically an invitation, right? These people would invite you to come, and they would ultimately, since they invited you, would be responsible for you in the event that you were not productive enough to support yourself, and things of this nature, right? And that's what I'm saying would happen in a free society. Immigration certainly would happen. For all I know, it would happen at a much larger rate than it does now, but only upon invitation. And thinking about, and you say, well, okay, so what? People would just invite tons and tons of people. Well, wait a minute. They would be financially and possibly legally responsible for these people to some degree, right? So they wouldn't just be inviting people that would come over and not be economically viable on their own, right? Or they would bring them over and they would take full responsibility for them financially, right? So they couldn't take on, just as Merkel says, we can't take on essentially an unending number nor could an individual. They would be much more limited, obviously. So I think the whole point is the immigration would be much more carefully undertaken when the individual has some potential, the sponsor, we'll call him, has some liability there, right? Where if there is no sponsor, there is no liability. If I come and I have no resources whatsoever, I've got nothing to lose by misbehaving, right? By violating people's property rights. But if I had a sponsor, I'd have somebody really on me to say, hey, you can't be doing this stuff. You must behave. You must go get a job because I can't support you forever. Otherwise, I'm going to have to wind up buying you a ticket to return you to where you came from, right? So again, my point is I believe it would be a much more carefully vetted process. Whereas when a bureaucracy does it, does a bureaucracy ever bear responsibility for what happens? No. As an example, the border issue of the southern border of the United States, now the government really never takes responsibility. The problem is those illegals coming over. Well, that would be like saying I sponsored somebody, they came over, they turned out to be a nutcase. I didn't have the wherewithal, say, to be responsible for them. And I say the problem is the guy who came over. Ultimately, the problem is mine that I sponsored irreputable person, right? And that's what would happen. The state never is responsible for that. And I believe, given the system we have now, they should be held accountable, but essentially they can't be held accountable. So they're in a perfect position. They can never do wrong. And I cannot understand why people would support such an organization that can never be held accountable. One of the discussions I had not too long ago was about police when they're abusive and people bring lawsuits against them. The police not only don't they bear the consequences of those suits and their misdeeds, right? They can't. It's not possible. What happens if people sue a city? The city pays, so the city has to take that either out of their budget, their operating budget that they were going to, I don't know, build a road with or a building. They no longer can afford to do so, or they raise your taxes. The bottom line is the citizen always pays. The police don't pay. And again, I don't understand why people support and say this is the best way, this is the only way to deliver these type of services. I just find that always amazing that people will do that, and I believe in most part they do so out of their indoctrination. They're not really willing to enter into some heavy thought as to what are the pitfalls of such an organization, what are any possible benefits of which I could argue I don't personally see any, but nothing that is done by coercive interaction couldn't be done better by voluntary agreement or action, right? That's the bottom line for me. So that's kind of that was a little smaller part on the EU. Again, I think the EU is obviously doomed to fail. It has to be doomed to fail. Why? Because it's not based on respect for property rights rooted in self-ownership. That's the bottom line. That EU system, and I can probably, well, I'm sure I could point to any single government that's in place today, and they're largely rooted in the violation of property rights, and that's going to lead to conflict, and that's why they're ultimately doomed. Whether it's the EU, the United States, the German government unto itself. Yes, they can last a really long time. They have lots of tools at their disposal to continue their dominance, their tyranny, right? They have control of so many things that they can persuade people constantly. So it take a very long time for people to understand, and I guess that's in large part purpose of this show, to get people to think about it at least. I'm not here to try to convince you of anything. The only thing I would be here to, that I guess I'm a little more insistent upon, is that, hey, if you want to be a statist, I'm all good with that. But don't force me to be part of that state, right? And again, if the whatever form of government you support is you think the best thing, it's great, it works, whatever, it's proven to be so, however you want to formulate your argument, well, if it is such a good argument, I don't believe you'd need to force me to either join or stay in that sort of arrangement, right? I'd be able to opt out. If it's so great, let me just be stupid and opt out and be on my own or go elsewhere. And when I say go elsewhere, I don't mean physically go elsewhere. I know this is also a long, drawn-out argument that I've had many times with people, that they say, well, if I don't like it here, I should just leave. Well, my view, and I think I have the logic to back it up, is others are aggressing on me. If I'm being aggressed against, why am I the one who's supposed to leave? If anybody would have to leave, I think it would be the aggressors. What I prefer is the aggressors just no longer aggress. I think that's how we live in harmony. Again, a little off the beaten path. So anyway, the more meat of this episode I wanted to talk about was a Huffington Post article by reporter Daniel Marins. And I think this article is about a week old. And again, if I haven't posted this one as well, I will put it on the Facebook page shortly for your review, for your reference. But I just thought this was an interesting one. I think the title is Economists Troll Germany, Telling It to Leave the Euro First. And if you're not real familiar with what's been going on with the European Union, maybe the main item at the moment, or maybe the main item in the news, I'm not saying it's the biggest issue there, I'm just saying it's the biggest issue in the news, is Greece. Basically, its insolvency, its inability to pay its debts, right? And Greece, as being a member of the EU, is saying, hey, to the European Central Bank, International Monetary Fund, and I don't know what other possible lenders, probably they're asking them all, is my guess, hey, give us a loan so we can get through these payments. Well, it's not sustainable to live off of loans, to be sure. You have to have your house in order. Greece hasn't had that. It hasn't had it for a long time. Before they had the drachma, they were able to print their own currency, which is what the European Central Bank is doing anyway. They're all doing that. The problem is Greece is not in singular control of that bank, where they were before when they had the drachma. So they have to negotiate, right? And by and large, with the Germans, which brings us back to Angela Merkel, right? Why? In large part, they're the economic powerhouse and the EU. So when you want money, where do you go? To the folks who have it, right? The formula is certainly more complicated than that. The German people, by and large, have a guilt complex that they're trying to atone for misdeeds during World War II. I'd have a lot to say about that, but I'm not even going to go there right now. But the point is there's more at play than just the fact that the Germans, Belgians, etc., are largely the holders of wealth there in the European Union anyway. But what I thought was really interesting is some economists that were the support for this article that we're addressing here tonight. They say that the Greek exit idea, they call it Grexit, right? Short for Greek exit. They have it all wrong, that the Greeks should exit. They say if any one country should leave the Eurozone, they argue it is Germany. Now, being a supporter of liberty, I think that's a great idea. I think everybody should exit the European Union, and I think I'm not saying that's the end all. I mean, that's what we should have. I'm just saying that's the right trajectory. In other words, that's the beginning of the process. I think if you continue that process eventually down to the individual, you have a free society, right? And again, that would take a long explanation. I'm not going to get there. But the point is, a decentralization essentially, I think, is beneficial to society. And I understand people are going to say, well, wait a minute, it was so hard to, you always had to deal with different currencies when you went to different countries. I don't see that as an issue, especially with technology going forward today with essentially with credit cards. And again, I'm not the greatest supporter of the banks as we know them because they're in bed with the state. If the state didn't exist, they wouldn't be the type of banks that you're familiar with today. So don't get on me about, oh, you just want the banks to get bigger, right? The point is, with a credit card, a world card, I think it would be very easy to just use that credit card and you wouldn't. And again, I understand people in a lot of cases want to use cash, and I'm a big supporter of that. Sure, it would add a complication, but I don't know. How many times do people go at a place where they go, I need 15 different currencies? I think it's usually a one deal. You prepare, for your trip. You say, hey, I need Deutschmarks. You convert some money either before or shortly after your arrival. Use Deutschmarks while you're there, and you go away. And again, a lot of countries, even today, you can use U.S. dollars in a lot of places. I assume back in the day you could use Deutschmarks in a number of other locations. Maybe not as many as the U.S. dollar, because the U.S. dollar, I understand, was the world currency. It's losing that status, obviously. But the point is, it's not like you say, well, you can only use it within those borders. So there's some flexibility built into the system anyway. So anyway, some of those objections I think are just, I don't know, I just call them technical in nature. And I think technology easily overcomes that in short order. And you say, well, the technology doesn't exist right now. Maybe in part it does through the credit card. Maybe a debit card would be able to do that, a world debit card. But the point is, it doesn't need to now, right? Because there's relatively so few currencies, right? If there were a multitude of currencies, I believe there would be a number of people who, if there's a market for again, we'll just call it a world currency card, I believe, the incentive would be there certainly for someone to create such a mechanism to overcome those problems. So I don't personally see why that's insurmountable, but maybe it would prove to be. And you would be dealing with frequent exchanges of currency. Anyway, again, I went way too far onto that, but I wanted to focus on what the economists had to say. Again, remember they said, hey, if anybody should leave, maybe it shouldn't be the Greeks, it should be the Germans. And this is, I'm doing a fair amount right from this article. It says, these economists' basic premise is that Europe's depressed economies, which include not just Greece, by the way, but Spain, Portugal, Ireland, and Italy. I think they used to call them PIGS, P-I-I-G-S. Portugal, Ireland, Italy, Greece, and Spain. Anyways, that was the acronym back in the day. I don't know if they still use that. Would benefit, but think about this. This is the economist saying, this is interesting. He says, would benefit tremendously from a cheaper currency. I thought the whole deal was, getting together and having one currency just makes things easy. Also, there's a downside here, and this with these economists, and I don't know some of these economists, one I'm going to comment on here in a little bit, but they're likely statists, right? And I'm always questioning, do they really know what they're saying here? Do they really understand? They're undermining much of what they normally say. But think about this. Devaluing the euro would help boost those poor or depressed economies tremendously from a cheaper currency. Devaluing the euro would help boost their exports and even spur domestic spending, as moderate price inflation would prompt consumers to lock in deals at current prices. I'm, again, reading from the article, but currently, these mostly southern European countries are stuck with a currency value that is boosted by the inclusion of Germany and other wealthier European countries. High investor demand for a currency that includes the German juggernaut keeps the euro's value relatively high. So in those regions that would benefit from a lower value currency, their currency value is higher than it otherwise would be because of the stronger economies, right? But there's a converse to that. right? The euro is of a lower value because of those depressed economies. So Germany would have a higher value to its currency had it been alone, or maybe with Belgium and a few other the wealthier countries in what is now the European Union, right? So if the point is, if the stronger economies were able to break away from the weaker economies and separated their currencies, they would float, right? Again, they won't fully float because they're manipulated currencies. But if, they would be closer aligned, likely. Now, again, if they were private currencies, they would be fully floating and they would reflect the strength of their own currency and what they're backing as well. Again, that's a little bit deeper than I wanted to go for this discussion. But hopefully you see the point that to the Greeks, the euro currency is of higher value than they would like it to be, or higher than what actually reflects their regional reality. And the Germans have the euro reflects a lower value than what is reflects their regional reality, right? So there's a compromise there. Some guys are accepting a lower value, others a higher value. But my point is, these economists that are cited in this article are saying, hey, there's benefit to breaking apart here because the currencies can reflect realities better. And my argument, again, on the trajectory thing, right? That, okay, decentralizing. We'll have a number of questions for you, and I probably answered some of them, but I didn't really intend to answer them. I just want to leave you with the questions. Wouldn't a consumer more stringently regulate the value of currencies, right? Currencies are either going to be regulated by consumers or users of that currency, or they're going to be regulated by bureaucrats, right? Who maybe in large part are also users, but they're regulating from the bureaucracy standpoint, not from the consumer standpoint. So who do you think regulates more stringently? And then the next thing is, if you think consumers would regulate more stringently, why not continue the logic presented by the economists that are referenced in this and promote private currencies? Again, I think they can't go there for a variety of reasons. But those that do not offer what consumers demand, right, in a free market, will either improve their services, right, in this case largely in the form of preserving their currency's value, or they'll become obsolete as consumers choose a different currency, right? So why not support a free market for currencies? Or should we only support a free market for labor and a hampered market for everything else, essentially, as statists do? Shouldn't we support a society in which all are rewarded when they satisfy market demands and conversely bear the consequences of malinvestment, right? And under what circumstances that happen? Under circumstance of a voluntary exchange, a voluntary agreement. I don't understand why that is seen. Well, I should say I do understand, but think about it. That's not an evil association whatsoever, but it is seen as an evil association. The rich will get richer. They'll hold power over you. They can't, with the proper definition of the word power. Again, I don't want to go so deep in that. We certainly can address that another time. Tanya does a very nice job of addressing that. I think her analogy uses Tyson chicken usually when she talks about power. Anyway, moving on. A German departure from the Eurozone and return to... I'm back to the article, by the way. I'm sorry. A German departure from the Eurozone and return to the Deutschmark would reduce the Euro's value dramatically. They're saying the remaining, right, members of the Euro. So the Euro's value would go down, providing Europe's weaker economies with the cheaper currency they need to restore growth and competitiveness. Now, let me just give my explanation on why this is true. Again, I don't have the explanation of what these economists are thinking. Think about it. If you have a currency as a country, say Italy, that's stronger than it otherwise would be. When you sell your product that's made in Italy, say to someone in the United States, another company in the United States, they have to pay you essentially, bottom line is the price is in euros. If you were able to reduce the value of your, we'll just call it for the moment, Italian euro, that reduces the price to your seller, right? So here's what they're pointing out. If their euro, if the weaker economies break away, the value of their currency goes down, their products essentially become cheaper to the world market, which is one of the ways that their economy gets spurred on, right? That's something that's not happening because the euro is, to them, is relatively strong. So here we go. There's a Princeton economist in this article, and I apologize if I'm not pronouncing this person's name correctly. I believe it's Ashoka Modi. Imagines that other wealthy European nations like the Netherlands, Belgium, Austria, and Finland would leave as well as joining Germany in a new union. Their departures would lower the value of the euro even more, right, than just Germany leaving, which would further benefit the continent's weaker economies, right? So what is he really pointing out? Decentralization works in their favor. But I'm sure the statist economists, and again, I can't speak specifically to Ashoka Modi. I do not know the man. I don't know his positions overall. I'm going to make the assumption that he's a statist. If he is, and if that's correct, he's saying stuff that contradicts most of what his positions are. But think about this. Germany stands to gain, this is according to the article, Germany stands to gain from an exit as well, since the new Deutschmark would be worth substantially more than the euro, enabling German consumers to benefit from cheaper consumer goods, right? So now we have a very strong currency, and I'm going over to buy Italian goods. I'm going to get more for my euro that way, right? So now Germany, who's a big exporter, they'll start importing more. And again, I'm not saying you benefit just because it's outside some imaginary line versus inside an imaginary line. The point is, if you get more for the same euro or dollar, right, that's more efficient. That makes those people instantly wealthier, right? The euro is worth more all of a sudden by the power of the pen, by this separation. I think that's a good thing for German people, right? And I understand probably most Germans would not want to leave the EU, but that's up to them, of course, to do so. The author also goes on to say, the disruption, I think actually this is from The Economist, again, in this article. He says, the disruption from a German exit would be minor. Modi, again, that economist, wrote in Bloomberg on Friday, because a Deutsche Mark would buy more goods and services in Europe, and by the way, in the rest of the world, than does the euro today. The Germans would become richer in one stroke. I guess I kind of already said that. I jumped ahead. A German exit from the euro would make German exports less competitive on the downside, right? If the new German euro, we'll call it for the moment, is worth more all of a sudden, when you want to go buy a BMW, a Mercedes, a Volkswagen, an Audi, they're actually going to cost more, right? So that's the downside for some of the German companies that are large exporters, right? Within the German economy, it's still a net nothing. It's just to the outside. And again, those things can be will have to be addressed through better technology, of which I'm not arguing. It appears to me that a lot of those German manufacturers have tremendous technology, and they're highly efficient in what they do. They'll need to figure out how to be more efficient, which they will do regardless. I mean, it's a world market. They're going to attempt to compete regardless, in my view. And these economists say, by the way, back at the article, say Germany's current trade surplus has been damaging to the world economy. I don't know if I fully even understand exactly what they're saying. I get, trade surplus, but I don't see exactly how it's damaging to the world economy. If it's a voluntary transaction, I choose to buy, say, a BMW, how am I damaged when I choose to do that on my own volition? I'm not forced to make that transaction. Apparently, I'm saying for me, that's the better deal, so I do it, right? On the other hand, the manufacturer is willing to exchange for, in my case, US dollars. So how are they damaged when they do it voluntarily? Again, I could go on that for a long time, but I'm going to stay away from that for the moment. Back to the article. Former Federal Reserve Chair Ben Bernanke made a similar argument about Germany's trade surplus in a Friday blog post on the website of the Brookings Institution, where he is now a resident economist, by the way. Isn't that just funny how these big wheels in government wind up being in the private sector and having cushy jobs? Bernanke said Germany's trade surplus and accompanying tight fiscal policies had depressed economic growth in the rest of Europe. He called for new Eurozone rules against trade imbalances in order to force Germany to lower its trade surplus. Again, I could go on with that forever, but I'll make sure the article's posted. You read it for yourself. And again, if somebody raises large issues this week on there and has a lot of interest, we'll talk about it some more. But some of the stuff I just find appalling, and I just don't even want to go there. The International Monetary Fund is called the latest bailout deal. Oh, this is another one of these. All right. So the backdrop is, again, the Greek exit it wasn't the final hour. It was after the final hour. A number of hours after the final hour, they came to this agreement, right? Well, now the IMF is saying the latest bailout deal is unworkable since it fails to restructure Greece's unsustainably high debts and is overly optimistic about the economic performance Greece will be able to achieve in order to pay down those debts, right? It's like taking a loan from the bank and you're going slowly underwater. You say, here's the deal. I'm going to get a new job that pays me 5 times as much, and then I'll be able to pay you back. Well, the question is, can you get that new job that does, in fact, pay you 5 times as much? I mean, if it does, it'll work. But sometimes those are unrealistic expectations. They don't come to pass, and you still can't pay, say, your car payment, right? Well, that's what Greece is facing here, and that's partly why they're saying this is unworkable. It's optimistic about the economic performance of Greece going forward. So if they don't believe they can pay that debt back, they're going to be right back here. And I think I'm going to get to that in a second here, but let me go on with the article. That means Greece will continue to need more loans just to meet its obligations to creditors and will be back at the negotiating table in a matter of months or years at most. So here we go. We're going to do the same thing over and over. They're going to go back to the till and say we need more money, and we'll see. And people will think the logic now is, well, we're staving that off by giving them the loan. And here you have the IMF basically saying, well, absolutely not. They're going to be back to us in a matter of months or years at the most. So back to the article, Eurozone leaders resisted aiding Greece until the end of negotiations and proposed a Greek departure at the last minute. They were only willing to assist Greece in exchange for the deepest austerity measures yet, including a fire sale privatization of some of Greece's state-owned assets. It is unlikely that the Eurozone will have a greater political appetite to lend to Greece if the current loans for austerity deal breaks down. Short of additional funding and liquidity support for its banks, Greece will once again face a Greek exit. So again, I ask you, what did this accomplish? Right? You are putting lipstick on a pig. There's still a pig there as far as I know. So then here's from, I'm going to be facetious here, one of my favorites, Paul Krugman. Here's a quote that's from the article. He says, my guess is that Euro exit will still prove necessary. And I think he means Greek exit will still prove necessary. And by the way, Krugman is a Nobel Prize-winning economist. And he said this in the New York Times on Monday. And in any case, it will be essential to write down much of Greece's debt. I like how they say, when they say write down the debt, I'm just curious, if you're listening, do you know exactly what that is? All that means is forgive the debt. You're not going to get, if you loan the money, you're not going to get your money back. Yeah. They don't say, go bankrupt. They don't say failed to repay their loans. You just don't say those things anymore. You just say write down the debt because it just doesn't sound very painful that way. It's just, some of this is just humorous. Again, maybe that's not a good way of looking at it, but yeah, to the creditors. And by the way, the creditors are the banks, and you say, a lot of people say, what do I care? And that's the banks. Well, the banks are going to suck the money out of the consumer one way or another, right? The point is, somehow, I don't know if the right word is but people who had no direct, did not partake in any of this stuff, they're going to ultimately pay for this. Trust me, the fellas who are really responsible, the first thing they're going to do is try to deflect responsibility away from them. Those are the last guys who are going to want to have to shell out any cash, right? They're going to rig the game so other people are. Remember last week's show, we talked about publicly funding stadiums and privatizing profits and socializing costs. That's what these guys are masters of. And even maybe arguably, they're even more masterful at getting the citizenry, the public, to support their shenanigans. That's the thing I really get blown away. And I realize you've been bombarded with this propaganda for so long that I get it. People believe it. But I'm wishing that people would kind of stop and think about it for a moment. I think they believe it simply because they've heard it. I don't think they've ever worked through the logic of what's actually happening here. And I think if you did that, at least you might go, that seems kind of strange, right? As long as you get there and you think, that's one thing Brad says about on this show. We aim to make you think. If you do that, I'm a relatively happy man. So I don't know. I just wanted to kind of end the show on that note. The whole EU thing, I guess I raised at the very beginning. The ultimate problem with the European Union, I don't care, the German government, the U.S. government, you point to any one of them, it's ultimately they violate property rights systematically on an ongoing basis, and unfortunately, increasingly, I think, as time has gone on. And as long as that is the case, you are essentially going to incite conflict. Until that issue is resolved, you can reform all you want. To me, reform is, here's the deal, we're going to steal from you guys in a different way, right? We're going to use different language. Instead of saying bankrupt, instead of failing to repay your debts, we're just say, write it down, right? They're going to use this on you. And I'm just amazed at how that works so well. Relative to the EU, the question is, how has the collectivization of the European continent raised the standard of living of ordinary citizens? I'm not arguing that some people have benefited from this in an unbelievable way. There are some muckety-mucks on the central bank board, and I know every country has like a bank board that reports to them and all that. All those cronies, they've done very well for themselves. I'm not arguing that. I'm saying for the individual, how have they benefited from the European Union? Other than, I know you're going to tell me, well, it's just a lot easier to go across the borders. In a lot of cases, there's no border control, so it's just simpler. It's easier. It's more convenient. And I also don't have to exchange currency. And so, sure, that's great. But in a free society, it does not mean there would be 80,000 different currencies as well. They would likely quickly consolidate. Why? To facilitate transactions conveniently. And again, I can't prove that to you. I'm just saying what I believe is likely to happen in a free society. But I think don't jump to the conclusion that a private currency is going to be, well, Tom dollars, there's going to be Fred dollars, Jim dollars, and boy, what a transaction nightmare that would be. The whole point of currency is to facilitate transactions. If I created my own private currency and it was not successful at that, I believe people would not use my currency. It would fail. Right? I would bear the consequences of not having a successful currency. So anyway, how has that raised the standard of living? How has the collectivization of the European continent raised the standard of living for ordinary citizens? And again, I believe only respect for property rights offers the best opportunity for the creation of wealth, not only in the European Union or what is known as the European Union, but everywhere, right? That's a universal ethic is the point. People want to and should rightfully keep the fruits of their labors. That does not mean there's no social safety net. It means that people would do so voluntarily. And if they weren't willing to do so voluntarily, that means they don't support whatever activity, right? And I think using force to support an activity that I believe I like is wrong, no matter what that activity is. Just because I like it, and that means I should be able to force you to put money into the pot to accomplish what I want. If I really feel so strongly, why wouldn't I go to you and just ask you and persuade you to do so? Again, the use of aggressive force is really the problem here. Again, in the private money, those operators of the private money would have the incentive to protect its value and to make sure that it facilitates transactions and performs all the functions of a successful currency, right? If they don't, there would be recourse against them. What? The consumer would likely choose a different currency. They would either have to change the way they're doing business, or let's say improve the way they're doing business, or they would get put out of business. And those people who don't do it successfully would no longer be in business. So only the people who would do it successfully would remain, right? So there's that recourse. That's the point. Think about this. If you support a state currency, right? What's the recourse against those who are regulating, right, these currencies, which, by the way, for the U.S. dollar, the Federal Reserve was created in 1913, if I have my dates right. And if you look at their charter, it's like one of the very first things is to preserve the value of the U.S. dollar, to preserve and protect it. And arguably, the U.S. dollar today is worth about 5% of what it was back then. I submit to you, if there was recourse against those guys, they'd be all fired. And you say, well, 1913, none of them are there right now, right? This is still going on. The dollar's being devalued as we talk, right? Those people, if it was a private currency, there'd be recourse against them, right? And again, this is people supporting this nationalism, the national dollar, and they are the ones who receive the deleterious effects of the chicanery that goes on by the bureaucracy. And I'm saying the bureaucracy is the one who should feel those effects directly, not innocent bystanders. So anyways, with that, I want to close the show tonight. I realize we've only gone about an hour, which is probably too long anyway. But, we always say on the show, heck, tell your friends, but heck, even tell your enemies about the show. We're on almost like clockwork, 7 o'clock Central Time, each and every Tuesday night live. You can listen to us archived as well at Spreaker.com. Just look for Annoying Peasant Radio there. I hope I provoked a few thoughts in your mind, get you to think of things maybe in a little broader perspective. And please feel free to make your comments on the Facebook page. We always like that exchange that we can get going there. Just a couple other things. My friend Paolo Fabrizio, he's a libertarian from Canada. He has a radio show over on blogtalkradio.com. It's called Liberty Rules Radio. Check out his show. Those guys are very entertaining. They're interesting. They just have a fun time over there. So if you have any interest in that, check that out. I also have another friend by the name of Paul. He has a show called Political Paradox Podcast. It's beautifully produced. He does a good job over there. He's at politicalparadox.ca. So a couple other things to look at. I always listen, well, I shouldn't say always. I frequently listen to the Tom Woods show. He does a marvelous job. He has some interesting guests on. So you might want to check that out. He's at tomwoods.com. Of course, Lou Rockwell has his podcast. I strongly recommend anyone who has interest in the subject matter to check that out. So with that, I'm going to leave you tonight. Hey, I got some other different music, shall we say, to go for our outro here today. So thanks for listening to this edition of the Annoying Peasant Radio Show. We'll have something new for you next week. And with that, good night.